Yo, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. On this episode, we're looking at one of the games mentioned during the infamous 1992 ESRB court case panel that was a catalyst for the rating system we've seen on our video games in the United States since 1994. While Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were a primary focus during this case, this light gun shooter was a hot topic with digitized characters and, for its time, relatively realistic combat. We're checking out Lethal Enforcers, developed and published by Konami, releasing to arcades in 1992. Console ports for the Sega Genesis and Sega CD were released in 1993, along with the Super Nintendo, which is the version we'll be looking at today. You're a Chicago beat cop that gets a call over dispatch informing your unit that a new crime syndicate has hit the city, and it's up to you and your .38 service revolver to clean up the streets. You're one of two officers left since the rest of the precinct is either in the ICU or worse. Your mission is to stop the crime syndicate and bring peace back to the city. Gameplay-wise, you'll battle through 5 stages set between various parts of the city, broken up into 3 sections each, where you'll smoke as many henchmen as you can leading up to that stage's boss. You start off with a .38 revolver by default, where you can fire off screen to reload or hit the Y button on a controller. You get 4 hit points per life, but once they're gone, you lose a life. You get 9 credits to run through all missions, but should you rinse all your continues, then you must start the whole game over again. Each stage puts you in different parts of Chicago, with scenarios like the bank robbery, subway, chemical plant, and even a stage that references O'Hara Airport. Stages scroll either left to right and at times vertically, where numerous enemies will pop out of cover, trying to butter your bread. Most enemies go down in one shot, but there will be several that take a few hits to vanquish. Each stage has civilians that will get in the line of fire and must be avoided, considering if you hit them, you lose a health point, with each civilian harmed. Shiesties, gas mask, and shades are typically indicators of the ops, whereas friendlies will be in street clothes. But be warned, some of the ops will blend in until they prepare to attack. You've got an arsenal of weapons to even the odds, like the semi-auto pistol, shotgun, assault rifle, submachine gun, and grenade launcher. As long as you don't get hit while these weapons are equipped, you can keep them through the majority of the level with the exception of the SMG and the grenade launcher. Downside is, if you take even 1 hit while a special weapon is equipped, you default back to your service revolver. Scoring works by giving you 8 points per target and 10 points for hidden targets, and once you get 2,000 points, you'll get an extra hit point. While you can get extends, you can't get extra continues. Bosses will be at the end of each stage on its 3rd level, and these encounters will have syndicate generals throwing everything they got at you, including a few dozen ballistics. Bosses will have a life bar, and once you deplete it, you move on to the next stage. Bosses will be stocked up and armored, especially the battles near the end with the helicopter bosses and the subway encounter where you have to thread shots through open windows. Bosses will light you up fast unless you can stun lock or disarm them. Until you figure out weak points and patterns, this is where you'll see your hit points and continues rapidly disappear at times. Considering the limit on credits, being able to pick which levels you do in what order can help you through the tougher encounters and get them out of the way early. Graphics wise, Lethal Enforcers uses photorealistic sprites, which is part of the reason why it, along with games like Sega's Night Trap and Midway's Mortal Kombat, sparked the debate about video games having realistic violent content. This would lead to Lethal Enforcers being one of the first games to officially receive an MA17 rating, eventually leading to the ESRB rating system, which will be a common sight on console and PC games moving forward. Sprites would be comprised of digitized photos, which give the game its realistic appearance. The controversy really came from enemies being pumped back when hit, and the red bullet hole on screen when you get hit. This will be censored for the Super Nintendo version, where enemies would fade away unlike its arcade counterpart. Names of stages were also changed to remove references to substances and derogatory terms. Your screen also flashes green instead of red, while retaining the bullet hole damage indicator. Enemies will crop up all over the screen on several planes and distances, along with vehicles that come into the frame every so often. There's a lot of moving parts in the stages, like the hidden bonus items and elements like the escalators and passing boats in the docks, for example. Stages where you're in pursuit of the syndicate have you on the road blasting the ops, and these break up the static areas and make for some interesting boss encounters. Bosses are all syndicate generals that will have a variety of set pieces and weaponry. There's a stage where you fight a guy firing a rocket launcher at you from the passenger bay of a moving airplane, amongst 2 battles with helicopters. The helicopters, much like Midway's Revolution X, need to have every piece shot away from the craft, otherwise you'll get smoked like a Sunday brisket. Environments are done in a similar fashion to the sprites, taking photographs of urban areas and digitizing them in the stages. You get a decent assortment of areas for encounters with static and scrolling sections throughout. Playing through each stage is like being in the shootouts from Miami Vice episodes, and these get pretty buck. The car chase sections are also pretty funny since each vehicle seems to have an endless buffet of ops. The chemical plant also has a part where you use night vision goggles, so you're getting a good variety of stages and themes to set them apart, aside from the censorship on the Super Nintendo version. The Sega CD and Genesis versions, however, are uncensored like the arcade. Sound-wise, Lethal Enforcers is slapping kinda hard. The soundtrack, composed by Kenichiro Fukui, is stacked with nothing but belters that feel like 90s action cinema incarnate. Each track is hyped, with a couple of them being more moody in line with cop drama shows like Miami Vice, or even films like the Dirty Harry or Death Wish series. The Super Nintendo percussion warms the tunes up nicely, and if you can find the Sega CD or PlayStation version, you can get a nearly 1-to-1 arcade original soundtrack. Enemies and civilians also have a decent amount of speech modulation, where the enemies shout phrases at you and the friendlies tremble tremble in fear as they flee. There's a fair amount of voice lines between each character, and the boss's taunts only fuel the ambition of defeating them. There's also an announcer that narrates each stage title and when you pick up new weapons, which sounds pretty good for the hardware. Weapon audio feels lifted right out of the Foley recordings of 90s movies and television, with some familiar sounds of gunfire. With an arsenal of burners to blast, each one has some solid feedback from the revolver to the assault rifle. Bullets hitting various surfaces also have unique audio cues, and the attention to detail is pretty solid. To sum it all up, Lethal Enforcers is a pretty fun light gun game and somewhat of a time capsule for how we ended up getting a universal rating system for our video games. Much like the popularity of martial arts of the 80s and 90s in the United States, cop dramas and action heroes were right alongside them, and this does a decent job of putting the player in such scenarios. The difficulty is about where it should be, and it's much easier using the Justifier pistol if your television can support it. I'd argue this is one of the better light gun games for the console, but the heavy censorship does take away from the technical aspects despite them overall being pretty good. Lethal Enforcers for the Super Nintendo gets a 7 out of 10 and comes recommended for fans of light gun shooters and arcade ports that have a decent but fair challenge. This will clap you up the first few times, and learning optimal routes to conserve continues will certainly help make this game easier to complete, but be prepared for a showdown. This is typically a cheap game for the system, going for around $10 for loose copies, though complete in-box copies can go for nearly $200 at the time of this recording. The home ports would continue with Lethal Enforcers 2 Gunfighters, but unfortunately Nintendo passed on the sequel. Sega, however, did not pass releasing it to the Sega CD and Genesis and the PlayStation, which will be another one we'll talk about soon enough. Considering for the time, and even by today's standards, the graphics are tame compared to some of the games we'll discuss in the near future. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, and if you found these videos helpful, that's awesome. Glad to use it as a resource. To check back often, we'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.